Hello, and welcome to the presentation of my leadership project. My name is Ryan Zeck. I'm an attorney from California working primarily on real estate matters, both in litigation and transactions. Because of my work on real estate projects, I have elected to focus my leadership project on ways to improve and streamline processes in large real estate development projects. These projects can vary from relatively small-scale projects like 3-unit condo developments to 100-unit government-backed affordable housing projects. The soup to nuts process in guiding these projects from procurement to construction is complex. Our current practice does not have really any standard procedures for this process, which I sought to address in this project. This presentation will first identify my project vision and SMART goals, followed by a discussion of my action plan. I will conclude by conducting a post-mortem of my success in achieving my goals and lessons learned along the way. My vision for this project was to research, design, and implement a dynamic onboarding program for residential and commercial real estate development projects to streamline financing, management, and construction. This onboarding program will include a detailed step-by-step intake procedure and process, starting from the formation of the development sponsor entity to the completion of the underlying project. SMART goals are defined as goals that are specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-limited. My SMART goal was to, by the end of this course, develop a detailed master intake questionnaire, checklist, or framework for housing development projects that incorporate all the steps necessary for such projects from start to finish. The questionnaire and checklist must serve as a guide for development of underlying project documents, including the corporate entity formation, the construction contract, financing agreements, and ultimately through project completion and occupancy of these development projects. This SMART goal is specific because the task is to create a document to answer intake questions for new development projects, including step-by-step procedures for procurement and implementation of such projects. It's measurable because accomplishment of this goal is measured by the completion of the underlying document. It's actionable because the task is clearly defined with parameters for completion. It's realistic because the task is discrete and achievable, considering the resources I have available and the complexity of the task. And finally, it's time limited, meaning the task will be completed by the end of this course, ideally, which provides an actual time deadline for project completion. The action plan. My action plan consisted of 5 steps. The first step was to research and create a list of stakeholders and participants that I'm going to need for the project. This ultimately required that I determine who's going to be on my team. I also needed to understand the overall needs of the project, and to do this, I had to interview those who have worked on prior projects, I had to research the prior projects, and also speak with clients to understand their needs from beginning to end for real estate development projects. I had to look at what particular roadblocks we've encountered in the past on projects and to understand resources that may be needed to overcome these types of roadblocks. The leadership skill that I used in step 1 was setting direction. Step 2 required an interview of the stakeholders to determine what their particular subject matter expertise may be, and to also help develop the roadmap that I ultimately created in step 1. I had to figure out the resources necessary in conducting these types of projects, and by doing this I had to conduct several meetings with both internal stakeholders, those at my firm, and also external stakeholders, clients, and others who've worked on projects in the past. This ultimately was part of creating an essential, necessary list and components and to introduce the project to others. This introduction was fairly complex because of the dynamic nature of these projects. These aren't a kind of one-size-fits-all type of project, so I had to conduct several meetings, both in person and Zoom, which required coordination and ultimately understanding how this process was going to work out. The leadership action that I used in step 2 was leading others. Step 3 is creating the rough draft of this intake questionnaire flowchart. This happened about a week after I had the meetings with stakeholders and both internal and external stakeholders. And after gathering that information, I created this rough draft flowchart for these projects. This took much longer than I expected and was the first hang-up that I had, the first roadblock that I encountered that I'll discuss later. Ultimately, the rough draft was not up to the quality and usability that I intended, and required me to go back several times and make adjustments. The leadership skill that I utilized in step 3 was self-awareness. Step 4 was obtaining feedback. This is where the project languished. After I created my rough draft flowchart, I sent it to team members to obtain their feedback. We held several other meetings to discuss the feedback process, including what I was looking for as the end product. Some of the team members ultimately got pulled in other directions, which led to an inability to move the process and project past step 4. I needed to obtain feedback to move this forward because I had certain questions on areas that I had no expertise in, for example, like finance. I had to talk with finance folks to get more input on how we can create kind of a sub-list of finance steps, and I ultimately was not able to do that because the finance folks got pulled into a time-sensitive project that took away their focus from this particular step. The step 4 leadership action was leading others. In step 5 was to finalize the product. I did not get to this step, unfortunately, because I got hung up in the feedback process. But what I intended in step 5 was to create the actual final flowchart checklist after obtaining feedback from folks. But again, this did not happen because of time constraints and other projects that took priority over my particular project. The leadership action that I intended on using in step 5 was leading teams, but again, we didn't get there. As previously discussed, my intended outcome was to create a final flowchart intake checklist for these real estate development projects. The actual outcome, unfortunately, was no outcome. I got hung up on the rough draft process, and which had a lot of holes. It wasn't ready for prime time, and it needed a lot of work, which I ultimately had to rely on others to help me fill those gaps because it was areas that I did not have an understanding of or expertise in. This was where it got hung up in step 4, the feedback process. So my actual outcome was not achieved. Barriers and challenges, of which I had many. There were 2 barriers. One was obtaining buy-in from the team members. And the leadership challenge here in obtaining buy-in was really part of step 3 and 4, but ultimately kind of an overall project buy-in. I really needed to develop better persuasion skills with my peers and superiors to convince them that this project was worthwhile and to create a overall kind of understanding of why this should be a priority over ongoing projects that we have. I needed to use leadership skills like building credibility and also identifying the best persuasion methods to get those who are either neutral or uninterested in the project. I was concerned that pursuing this project may impact my own personal and professional growth, as my superiors may not consider the project as being critical or the best use of time. So I ultimately thought that that was a fairly major concern. The second barrier was time management, just ultimately understanding how long this project was going to take and devoting the necessary time for each step and allocating time for each step. And to address these barriers, the first step was to address the buy-in issue. I first sought feedback from my classmates, and I got suggestions on how to kind of isolate one or two of the major team members to create what my classmates suggested as creating a political bloc to sway others. I tried this, which worked for that particular person, but unfortunately, that did not seem to sway others. Strategy ultimately was not as effective as I intended, and I think it was largely due to distractions from other projects at work and other time commitments. Second, for time management, it became very clear to me that I was not managing my time effectively on the project, causing it to fall behind schedule. I spent too much time on the research portion, caused me to fall behind on all the other tasks. To address this, I went and revisited my SMART goal, which I think is really important when you have project issues. You need to go back to the drawing board, look at your SMART goal, and see if refinements can be made. And I ultimately changed my final step to be not creating a final product, but to create a rough draft. Reflection. What went well? Well, first, the research and interview steps of my project went really well. I initially obtained a good head of steam in developing a strong idea and understanding of the project. Initially, the stakeholders were very engaged in the beginning and willing to help out in creating the flowchart and ultimate project end product. What was challenging? The biggest challenge was keeping interest in the project with the team members. As discussed earlier, others were retasked to other projects when I needed them focused on my project. This created time constraints, which caused my project to fall off schedule. And finally, what would I do differently in the future? In the future, it'd be better to create a SMART goal that was more realistic, the R in SMART, including a better understanding of how realistic my goal was ultimately, and also having a better time limitation, the T in SMART projects, that was achievable within the time frame that I ultimately thought would be achievable.